Her Excellency, Lord Tuivakana, thank you very much indeed. That was a truly inspiring and very thought-provoking keynote speech. We're very grateful to you for that. Can I now invite Duncan Green to the stage? Duncan is one of the great thinkers, I believe, on international development. His recent book, looking at the challenges around development issues, is a classic, and if you haven't read it, I would strongly encourage you to do so. Even more influential is his daily blog, or I think probably more often than that, and which has an enormous following. Frankly, anyone interested in international development needs to read what, sir, you produce, which is always inspiring, often quite trenchant, and the one or two times you've mentioned my name has always been complimentary, so I'm deeply grateful to you for that. And so far. And I'm determined to keep it that way, given the range of contacts and influence you have. But as basically this centre of policy thinking in Oxfam, your influence on many issues is significant. And having worked in this area in different jobs over the years, I have seen the influence that you have had, and also been very grateful to you for that. So it is an enormous pleasure to invite you to present to us your ideas. And before I forget, I would also mention that Duncan grew up here in Singapore and is therefore a strong friend and a man of great enthusiasm for matters Singaporean. So it is truly a pleasure that you have come back for the first time since your childhood. Yeah. And so, without embarrassing him, I think there's also part of sort of going back down memory lane, which we are also very pleased to facilitate. So, without further ado, can I invite you to the stage? Thank you very much indeed.
Good. I'm afraid as a good NGO person, I'm incapable of speaking without a PowerPoint. I apologise. I don't have the Prime Minister's skill with oratory, so I just work through slides. Here's someone much cleverer than probably all of us put together in the room. Stephen Hawking saying, "This is the century of complexity." So what I want to do is try and sort of talk through what that phrase means, what complexity is, and then its implications for how we think about development and how we act on development. Because I work for Oxfam, which is a large international NGO, we're always thinking about the practical stuff. Academics get very annoyed with us because we always say, so what? What do we do on Monday morning? And especially on issues like complexity, they get very irritated, but tough. We just keep asking those questions because we're impatient people. So let's have a look at some complexity. This is a mind map of Afghanistan drawn up for the US military. So even the US military subject each other to PowerPoint. And what's interesting about this is that when it was leaked, everybody laughed at it. Went around saying, what do they know? And then when I looked at it, I thought, actually, they obviously know quite a lot, because it's actually a very good map of what's going on in Afghanistan. And they've got a lot of very interesting ideas, institutions, concepts, all mapped together with lots of connections. This is a complex system. The point about a complex system is that if you poke it with $100 million of aid or 10,000 US Marines, there are so many feedback loops that effects will ripple through that system, and it is entirely unknowable what the impact of that intervention will be. It's not that you're not clever enough, you cannot know it. And that is the big difference between complex and complicated. Let me just unpack that a little bit. 3 kinds of system, right? A simple system, baking a cake. If you have the right ingredients, you have an oven, however bad a cook you are, you can make a cake which you can more or less eat. Even I can make a cake which you can more or less eat. Some people make nice cakes. My cakes don't look like that, but you can make a cake. That is a simple system. A complicated system is one where you need a lot of brain power, a lot of computer power, a lot of skills, but if you've got that, you can plan a trip to the moon, and you can probably get there and probably come back. That's a complicated system. But a complex system is one where there is no plan. If, when your baby is born, you come up with a plan for the next 18 years, a logical framework analysis, or anything like that, and say, I have now mapped out the activities I'm going to input to my child for the next 18 years, and at the end of it, there will emerge a beautiful adult. You are deeply misguided. A serial killer, possibly, but not a mature adult. And the point about that is raising a child is a complex system. It involves constant feedback, learning together, co-creation, some leadership, but it's a much more subtle and interactive process, and you can't start with a plan. Tiger Mum's possibly accepted, but I don't recommend that book. But anyway, the problem with this is that the aid business, the business which I work in, and quite a lot of the planning business lives in cake world, right? So if you want to get funding from DFID, who I love deeply because they get quite a lot of funding from DFID, you go along with something that looks like this, okay? This sets out what your activities are going to be, what your outputs are going to be, the impacts, how you intend to measure it, and it's essentially a linear system involving a prediction of impact based on what you're going to do. You then go along and measure it, prove impact, and ask for more money, okay? So this is a cake. It is not Afghanistan. Some systems are more or less linear. If you have one nurse, he or she can vaccinate X children. If you have 100 nurses, they can probably vaccinate roughly 100 X children. Yeah, there's a fairly linear, there are islands of linearity in a complex world. The danger about thinking in a linear way is you kind of feel more comfortable in those islands of linearity and you move towards them. You think about vaccines, you think about bed nets, you feel more uncertain about things like the empowerment of women or good governance. So the linearity introduces a distortion into how we think about the world. And many important processes are not linear. You know, this is a picture from 2010, I think, or 2011, the Arab Spring. No one predicted the Arab Spring. Okay, lots of people afterwards claimed they had predicted the Arab Spring, but no one predicted it. And this it's a classic feature of a complex system that changes unpredictable and discontinuous, sudden spikes and jumps. It's not a nice, smooth process. Coming to SIDS, I recommend Max's paper in your packs because I thought for me it was a very helpful sort of introduction to the topic. Clearly, there are some aspects of small island states which make complexity thinking particularly relevant. The vulnerability to shocks, you know, that discontinuous spiky change, which is such a feature of complexity and such a non-feature of that sort of Newtonian linear approach to development. Born of high dependence on commodity prices, which are very volatile, climate change, the Prime Minister's already spoken of. The less diverse you are, the more susceptible you are to shocks and sudden changes. Dependence on trade, food imports, for example. There are a number of things which increase the vulnerability to the erratic nature of complex systems. Shortage of skills. Interesting part in Max's paper about just how important leadership is in this quite sparse system. And the role of leadership, I think, is emerging in the development leadership program work. We've got some people here from that as an understudied and very important role. And, you know, Singapore bears witness to that, I think. And the idea that the social capital, the networks of trust and communication within SIDS are particularly dense is an interesting, almost like a counterbalance in that can provide greater degree of resilience. So I think a lot of the aspects feed into thinking through SIDS in terms of complexity and systems thinking. So this is just a quote from the UN, Sustainable Development Knowledge Platform, which I'm sure you all know by heart. But it says, SIDS, their pursuit of sustainable development is particularly severe and complex. So if you've got a complex world and you've got a tendency to plan, is planning irrelevant in a complex system? And I would say definitely not. But I think the nature of planning has to change. So some of the things which planning has going for it, you have to allocate resources somehow. And if you're not going to do it by planning, I dread to think how you would do it. Probably the way we do it in Oxfam. Who shouts loudest, that kind of thing. The act of planning builds common goals and approaches. I mean, the actual discussions around planning are often more important than the plan that comes out at the end of it. It gives you a measure of accountability. You have something to report against. There are clear benefits to planning, but there are some disbenefits, some problems with planning. I think it means that you have your head stuck in the plan. You miss windows of opportunity. One of the effects of shocks is not just negative. Shocks are often positive windows of opportunity. The Arab Spring in 2011 presented a number of possibilities, some good, some bad. Unfortunately, we've mainly seen the bad ones emerge. But there were real possibilities for progress during those upheavals in 2011. It means you stop listening. If you're very, very firmly entrenched in the plan, your feedback loops to the outside world, the conversations you have and whether you bring those into your work becomes weaker. So I think it's a real problem in terms of being embedded, having antennae out in the system so you see when things are changing quickly. And I really liked the Prime Minister's sort of description, fast exploration, quick detection, early recovery. You don't do any of those if you're stuck in a plan, which has become redundant because the situation has changed. So I think, particularly relevant. It gives you delusions of control, planning megalomania, where you actually mistake the plan for the world, and you start thinking that because you have a good plan, you're actually in control of events. And that leads to lying. There's some great studies of what aid workers actually do. And what they tend to do is they go out into the world, if they're good at their job, they respond to events, they surf, they improvise, then they come back to the office and make up a story about what they did, which is how they implemented the plan. Right? And good aid workers can ride these two horses at the same time, but riding two horses is not comfortable, and it's an enormous, scary, risky exercise. I think it'd be much better if we could just ride one horse, and it would be the right horse. So what I think is required instead, and I haven't yet seen the right phrase for it, so I'm going to call it an adaptive approach, which combines planning and surfing events, improvisation. You plan for capacity, and with that you use foresight, you try and see the range of things which are coming your way, you talk to people, and you then allocate the resources and the staff and whatever you need to do. But you accept that you're going to have to do, to some extent, improvise in the response as events take place. And I think three areas are worth thinking about in this. One is the enabling environment. Second one is sensing. Third one is responding. I'll explain what these mean. So if you don't know exactly what's going to happen, you can still create an environment which is more resilient, more able to respond. So some of the aspects of that I think governments and others can do to create that kind of environment. Equip people to respond for themselves. Yeah? So things like a sense of rights, education and health, access to information. These are the basics which people need to actually sort things out when they happen. And you don't know how people are going to use those rights, but you know that they're important. Political leadership, especially in SIDS, according to Max's paper, very important, this idea of a narrative which binds people together, especially during hard times. Moral messaging, that, where we were looking at some of the work around the food price spike in 2008, when food prices went up and a lot of communities were plunged into really deep trouble. in some countries, leadership consisted of just telling people, have you checked if your neighbour's okay? Have you actually, have you built on the social capital? Have the churches and the mosques gone out and actually, talked to the people in their area? These kind of very general moral messages are a very important part of leadership in unpredictable circumstances. And then steering through the shocks when they arrive. And I think the resilience that the Prime Minister talked about is increasingly, it's the flip side of vulnerability, and it's increasingly a part of our work. If you can build resilience generally, people will be better able to respond and build back better after a shock. So it's thinking about the system. Is the system resilient? Is the system some kind of monoculture, which is very vulnerable? Or is there diversity in the system? Is there an enabling environment in the system which will enable it to respond to shocks? And this idea of sowing diversity, I think, is quite an interesting one. If you look at a system, whether it's a livelihood system or a trade system, and there is very little diversity, that's probably going to be a problem at some point. So the diversification role is quite important. Sensing. Quick detection, as the Prime Minister called it. Fast feedback loops, absolutely essential. You have to actually know what's going on. And this is surprisingly difficult for people to actually have that consultative system where people feel that they're in touch with government and the government finds out quickly what's going on. Sentinel sites, this is more in larger countries, I guess, but where you actually have to know what's going on around the whole country, not just in the capital or the president's village. And prairie dogs, this is a metaphor really, but prairie dogs are those little animals who do this all the time. And that's the kind of people and the kind of function you need to watch what's going on in the system. Positive deviance. I'm afraid this is less interesting than it sounds. Positive deviance is in a big population of events or people or actors of any kind, there will be outliers. There will be some that are doing much better than others. And it's surprisingly rare for a government or an NGO or anyone else to say, okay, let's just go and look at why those outliers are outliers and what can we learn from that. When people have done that, some really interesting case studies, for example, on nutrition in Vietnam, you actually find unexpected lessons. You don't think you know all the answers, you just go and look for the answers out there amongst the particularly good performers. It's a really easy way to get fantastic learning, surprisingly rare that we actually do it. Getting better at failing. So a while ago in Oxfam, we invited our staff to come to a workshop and present their failures. And my team, the research team, took it at face value and we presented a catastrophic failure and we talked about what we'd learned from it. And then everybody after us, their failure were things like, I work too hard, I work at weekends, I'm too humble, and it proved absolutely impossible for people to actually admit failures to their colleagues, which is terrible because it's actually one of the best ways to learn how to do things better. So unless you create a culture in which people can fail forwards and fail and learn at the same time and discuss failures, you're wasting a huge amount of information and learning. And results. So anybody who takes the aid dollar is increasingly required to produce $2 worth of impact assessments, results, evaluation, learning, all the rest of it. I don't think there's any way of avoiding that. But what's important is that we use, so MEL is the aid acronym for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And what normally happens in the aid business is that you do the monitoring and evaluation to keep your funder happy, and you forget about the L bit, the learning, right? And we have to shift it so that we're actually using that exercise to do the learning bit, and that means counting what's important, not just what keeps the funders happy. It's a kind of results for grown-ups is my shorthand for it. So if you think the most important thing is the confidence of health workers to improvise and to deliver services and to listen to their patients and generally behave like good health workers, don't just count the number of consultations. Count something different which is more relevant to that. Ask the patients whether they think they're being listened to, for example. It's a bit harder. You need to invest in new techniques, but it'll pay off in the long term. So responding, as I said, shocks are enormous opportunities for doing things, for not just building back, but building back better. From the tsunami in 2004, some big things happened. Peace agreement in Aceh, land reform in several of the places that were hit, where essentially the tsunami wiped out the existing land patterns, and governments and societies worked together to get a fairer distribution of land. So some very interesting things there. And then some appalling academic jargon, which unfortunately conceals some very good ideas. So you have to just put up with it. So some very clever people at Harvard who seriously need some help with their jargon came up with problem-driven iterative adaptation. Okay? Now, I'd love to say it's rubbish, but actually it's a really good idea, which is the role of outsiders, and I count, I'm afraid, the UNDP as an outsider, and certainly count Oxfam in many cases as an outsider, is not to come in and say we know the answers, because we don't. What we can do is help create a dynamic where the local actors agree and explore a problem. That's the problem bit. They then come up with some ideas about how to deal with that. They experiment, and then they improve and adapt and iterate. And that's as a way of dealing with problems and a way of combining outsiders and domestic actors. It's quite a nice pattern. Harvard's doing some very interesting experiments with this at the moment. I think it's really worth thinking about. Another one, I noticed the Prime Minister talked about the use of indigenous knowledge. Absolutely. That there is a tendency, whenever you hear the words best practice, alarm bells should go off. Okay? Because best practice is context dependent, especially in complex systems. Best practice very easily looks like cookie cutters brought in by highly paid management consultants who just say, well, we did this in Rwanda, so let's do it in Tuvalu or wherever, Tuvalu. What works much better is hybrids, where ideas from outside are brought together with domestic institutions, norms, practices, and some very interesting research on how effective that can be in areas like education. But so it's not just a kind of romanticism of, let's just look for what's there already. It's combining what's there already with new ideas seems to produce the best results. Venture capitalism. As an NGO, I just like saying the words venture capitalism because it's actually a brilliant model of change in a complex system. A venture capitalist funds 10 startups because they don't know which one is going to be Google, right? And you accept that 9 of them are going to go bust, and that one of them is going to go big and make you very rich. That's the bit which is not so good for an NGO. But we started trying to do this, actually, on the ground. So some experiments in Tanzania where we tried 8 different ways of promoting accountability in one region, and then after 9 months sat down and decided which ones were working better and shut down the rest. In order to do that, you have to get better at recognizing and admitting failure. Right? The classic line on failure is, it's not a failure, it just hasn't succeeded yet. Right? So you have to say, no, you've got a year. If it doesn't succeed, then that's it. And then no regret solutions. If you're not sure what is going to work, then think about, well, if it doesn't work, is it going to hurt anyone? Is actually improving land tenure systems or doing other things in terms of response to climate change going to do any harm even if climate change doesn't affect us? I think it's worth thinking about, what if you only achieve half of what you're aiming for, or what if you don't achieve any of it? Will it still be actually quite a good thing? So thinking differently about, not assuming you're going to succeed or that you've got the right problem means you think differently about your intervention. Okay, so this is a very important slide because one of the problems about people who talk about complexity is that people then go away with this, oh no, everything's really difficult. Our responses are all going to have to be very complex. We're going to all need to go and do PhDs before we can even, write the next paper. A dog is much better at catching a frisbee than a physicist is, right? And this is a paper by one of the senior officials at the Bank of England called The Dog and the Frisbee. And he was arguing that I think he was essentially arguing that dogs would have been better in charge of our financial system than economists, but they didn't put it quite so crudely. His point is, a dog does not study aerodynamics in order to be able to catch the frisbee, okay? It does 2 things. it has a rule of thumb, or paw in the case of dogs, a rule of thumb which says, I'm going to look up at the same angle as the frisbee and I'm going to grab it. And then it does trial and error. Okay. Now actually in the development business, thinking more like a dog and less like a physicist often works. Trial and error is often the best way to find solutions in complex systems. So don't feel disheartened once you buy into complexity. It doesn't mean that everything you do has to be complicated or complex. It could be quite simple. You just need to think in a different way. Okay, I think I'm getting to the end in case anyone's getting anxious. This is more from the aid side, but I think this has profound implications for the kinds of people we employ and the kinds of training we provide. Ben Mallingham, who's written an excellent book on complexity and aid called Aid on the Edge of Chaos, summarized it by saying we should move from being people who know the answers to people who know what questions to ask. Embeddedness is a virtue. That is, people who have a lot of different networks, a lot of different connections in the world outside the office, and then bring it into the office, rather than thinking it's somehow illegitimate to raise those issues in the office. So I think embeddedness and how we encourage embeddedness is very important. Specialists struggle, I think, in terms of complexity, because you actually need to be a broker more than a specialist in many of these situations. Surfers who can see some things going down and some things coming up. Horizon scanners, networkers, the kind of activities that those people do, convening people, getting the right people in a room and helping them find solutions, that problem-driven iterative adaptation thing I was talking about earlier. Crowdsourcing. You know, I have an enormous struggle with people in Oxfam because they hate me publishing drafts on my blog. They think that somehow people will realize we don't have all the answers. And I say, well, actually, I think they already know that. And this is a way of crowdsourcing great ideas from a huge number of people. But the mindset is very alien for people in many planning communities. Encouraging experimentation, encouraging learning, encouraging failure. Again, very difficult. You know, if I go to DFID and I say, I've got a venture capitalist model, they say, great, have some money. If I go to DFID and say, I have a 90% failure rate, they say, you've got to be joking. But it's the same thing, right? So you need to encourage it, and that probably means using the right language. Okay, so just to show that this isn't just, you know, the insane ramblings of an NGO person, lots of people are thinking about this. There's an interesting group called Thinking and Working Politically, which is a coalition originally set up by the Australian government with the UK government, UNDP, World Bank, trying to say, okay, well, if we think that systems of politics and power are integral to development, how do we improve the way we think about it and get away from those linear technocratic solutions? USAID has just published a really interesting paper called 10 Principles for Engaging Local Systems for its staff, but it's on the website, which actually talk about how does a systems approach, which is essentially the same thing as complexity, how does that affect the way we work? DFID is actually testing some of these tools in Africa, and there's some results coming out shortly. And the Kennedy School, as I say, are doing some very interesting things at Harvard. I wasn't going to talk about Oxfam, okay, but Max asked me to, so this is by way of an excuse. So if you're going to do this in an NGO, you have to get it all very simple. So this whole phrase, this whole area of work is summed up in how change happens, right? Trying to get staff in Oxfam to think about the nature of change, how it happens, and then how we influence it. And some lessons are emerging from this discussion. One is the hardest thing in Oxfam, and I suspect more widely, is to stop people saying, what do I do, what do I do, what do I do? You actually need to create a space where people can really observe the system deeply and understand the system both in terms of statics and dynamics. How is it changing without me in it? And the longer you can keep people from not saying, so what am I going to do, the better. You need to have that sort of period of contemplation and observation. And we use ways to try and make the power visible in a community or in a country, see who the holders of power are, what are the coalitions, what are the moments of opportunity. There's a whole load of techniques about making that system visible in a useful way. A big focus on influencing. So what we're increasingly saying is, okay, NGOs only create small programs at best. And what's the point of creating little islands of good practice in a sea of something else? So increasingly, anything we do has to think about how does it influence the wider system. So accepting that you are not an island, that you want to be part of a wider process of change. And that involves more innovation, more knowledge, and not institutional amnesia, which is deeply rooted in the NGOs, where as soon as someone leaves, all their knowledge goes with them, this kind of problem. Shocks as opportunities. The easy ones are the predictable shocks, the elections, the death of old leaders, these kind of things. That's where to start, and then get better at responding to the unpredictable shocks as well. As I said, but increased focus on resilience, a system property which we think you can build. And I think in terms of the SIDS discussion, particularly important. And then trying to improve on the results agenda. Final slide. Trying to sum that up, this is how I think our way of working is going, which is you start at the top by understanding the system, a power analysis of how the power is flowing in this system, being renegotiated, who has it, who doesn't have it, what are the coalitions, who are the allies, that kind of question. Still not intervening yourself, you think, what are the dynamics of this? How is this change going to happen anyway? What's going on with demographics? What's going on with environment? How are things shifting? Then you select some interventions, preferably more than one. You try a bunch of stuff because you're assuming that you're not going to succeed. And then the key is, how quickly do you learn, adapt, drop the things that aren't working, try something else, and then you do it all again. It's not a sequential thing, it's a state of mind, and it's very, very different from that linear planning frame of mind I showed you right at the beginning. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much.
Duncan, thank you very much indeed. I think that was a great, and if I may say, typical tour de force of thinking through these issues. And I think your last slide provided us, and perhaps provided the Prime Minister, with the start of how to think constructively and operationally about issues of complexity and the significance of it, and how those ideas relate to the more familiar work on whole of government coordination. We also, of course, learned from you about the importance of positive deviance and thinking like a dog. Those ideas will perhaps, like so often, like good marketing, remain longer than the very profound and really helpful comments that you made. Having that level of insight, I think, and the importance of your role in Oxfam as, to my mind, one of the great moral leaders, organizations thinking about development issues, and the influence that your thinking has generally, I would like us to take the opportunity of having you here to throw the session open briefly for some questions or thoughts to Duncan on what was, I think, a very helpful and insightful presentation. So, are there any questions or ideas that you would like to ask Duncan about his presentation? Please.
I'm quite surprised by the term of reference when you talk about simplicity versus complexity and the modularity that appeared to be. Likewise, you talk about the dog dimension. But why not simplicity first before into complexity? My learned friend Jan is from the Complexity Institute, and it is correct that you team up with NTU for that matter. That's the first question. How do you make it more simpler than the complexity that you put it, number one. Number two, with regard to your Oxfam's organization, is not in the Pacific yet. You have multiple, but not in the Pacific except Hong Kong and Tokyo, Japan, for example. But why not Polynesia? Well, what's wrong, and why not that undertaken until now? That's about. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, okay. Other questions?
Thank you very much. I'm Jiyoung Song, Assistant Professor of Political Science from SMU, Singapore Management University. Thank you very much for your very insightful talk. I'm one of the complexity scholars that you might feel a bit uncomfortable. I was a bit offended when you said it's a sort of rubbish and it's a weird language that the complexity scholar was using, the problem-driven iterative adaptation. I think something missing from the complexity theory in your talk might be self-organization, a more agent-based approach when you talk about the adaptive approach as compared to self-organizing in a system level. And I'll probably have to ask you the same question that you asked for academics. You talked about the fast feedback is very important to keep the complex system working. But how do you manage to have the fast feedback into the complex system while avoiding the violation of privacy or data protection, for example? You talked about prairie dogs. You need someone who can play a role of watching out the public opinions or general feedback from the public, or in case stakeholders in international development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please.
Ruben Hintz, student here at the school. In terms of positive deviance, I'd be curious about your thoughts about China, which is, I think, now 500 million people out of poverty, the best poverty alleviation story in human history. And it usually doesn't fit in very well with the development discussions. I don't even think there's a single center in China that actually studies development per se.
So the first two questions illustrate the problem. So one person thought I was being too complicated, the other person thought I wasn't being complicated enough. And I think there is an issue here, which is that I find the language of the complexity scholars, and I've just had a completely mind-blowing day or two with them, some in New York, is really, really difficult, and I suspect needlessly difficult. So one of the jobs of people in my kind of role in NGOs is to, in my sort of research and communications role, is to try and take some of this useful but very complicated stuff and translate it into things that our staff can use. And this one is really difficult. Even the word complexity is verboten as soon as I use the word complexity, eyes start rolling in Oxfam. There he goes again, he's talking about complexity. It is very hard to do. So I think I may have done a disservice to Matt Andrews and friends at Harvard, but they know I say this, that's fine. And I do say it's a really good approach. We do work in Polynesia, Oxfam New Zealand, Oxfam Hong Kong, Oxfam New Zealand, Oxfam Australia do some work in Polynesia, I believe. But Oxfam UK has some sense of limits, I'm pleased to say. And Oxfam GB does not. And you're absolutely right. Self-organization, a crucial difference between complex systems and others is that they self-organize. Change emerges from the interaction of all these different agents, and you can't predict how that's going to happen. And so that's why you don't get a normal Gaussian distribution. You see, I'm off. It's terrible. But you get a different kind of distribution because things are affecting each other. It is really hard to read this stuff and stay intelligible. Trust me, I've tried. China, so China's, okay, yes, China's I love the China question. Whenever American scholars write about their theory of development, like Bill Easterly or Angus Deaton, they usually say things like, basically, the more you're like America, the better it is for your development. That's summarizing several books worth of thinking from those two eminent economists. And Acemoglu and Robinson, 4 eminent economists. And when you say, okay, and China, they go into some terrible, I don't know. So Bill Easterly recently tried to argue that China's success was based more on the introduction of the potato than Deng Xiaoping's reforms. Right? This is a very eminent economist saying very silly things because he can't answer the China question. I think China, in a way, I think you're right, is a counterexample in that China is a pretty top-down system, and they've delivered extraordinary results with a top-down system. They do, however, make great use of experimentation. So I think it's quite interesting the extent to which they set a number of experiments running. They never go straight to scale. They try things out, but then they have the command and control structure that once they've decided something works, they can suddenly get 200 million people into rural pensions in 5 minutes. And you look at it and you think, how on earth did they do that? So in some ways, I think you're right. It contradicts some of the thinking around complexity, and that's good.
Very brave man who's come into the centre of Singaporean academia and condemned turgid language. So my esteem for you, Duncan, has risen yet again. And an important hint for the Prime Minister of Tonga to cultivate more potatoes. So the conference is already off to a very good start. We have a few more minutes, though. Are there any other questions for Duncan? Because this is a great opportunity. Unless you're going to come with us on Thursday to find his childhood home, now is the opportunity to ask one of the great thinkers in development who's just condemned all American developmental thinking as well. And the more you say, the more I think the audience will warm to you. But are there any other questions, or would we like a cup of tea at this point? Going, gone? Oh, well, have another question then.
You didn't mention at all about the Port Moresby's, declaration, and thereafter there seems to be not much forthcoming for the Polynesian community. And I think that it's not a momentum, expectation that we would expect that the Polynesian would not be governed very much by dilemma and kind of a phobia with regard to climate change and things like that. It's endless to be, and it's stupid to think about it all the time. So I think that is there a better solution than looking backward and then rather than looking and moving forward? Thanks a lot.
Hi, I'm Ichtal Naqvi, a sociologist at SMU. Question I have for you about Oxfam and development interventions is that a lot of what we learn about development interventions is that they don't work nearly as well as we want. And yet one thing that I find is almost absent from the consideration of designing interventions and whether we should do them is the willingness not to do them, to step back and say, well, we can't do this. So if you could engage with that, please.
Thank you, Kat.
Kat Tully from the UK. To what extent is this really to do with development, small island states, or actually to do with the role of civil servants in all nations across the world?
I sort of hinted at this idea that lots of interventions don't work, and the two things about that is actually noticing when they don't work, so the whole failure discussion. But the no regrets thing, I think, applies to NGOs just as much, and aid agents just as much as it applies to governments. That you have to be sure, or as sure as you can be. You can never be completely sure, but you have to at least think through, what if this goes wrong? You have to notice unintended consequences, and you have to have feedback loops to know. And some of the really interesting work by Robert Chambers and others is precisely about the lack of those and the appalling consequences it has for things like, I've just been reading his stuff on the Indian irrigation system, where they just wrecked it, because they didn't have those feedback loops. They weren't aware of the possibility of failure. So I think absolutely we need to get better at living with failure and learning from it. I'm not, as you've probably realized, much of an expert on small island states. So I was trying to see how this applies particularly, and that's the stuff I drew out from Max's paper and the comments from the Prime Minister, but clearly it's of much wider relevance. Complex systems are not unique to small island states. In fact, they're universal, and that's what your paper for this morning said, and what some of Max's work shows as well.